Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Tech in EdTech. I'm very excited about today's episode. Our guest today, if you're in EdTech, you've probably heard of him. His newsletters are widely read. I'm a huge fan of his newsletters. But without further ado, welcome Matt Tower. Welcome to the show. I'm really excited to get started today.
You are very generous. I aspire to be that well known that people associate my name with ed tech. I don't think I'm quite there yet. But
You
thank
are
you.
there. You're there. But no, thank you, Matt, for taking the time out, coming on the show. I just want to start by saying that, the first time I got introduced to Matt Tower was a well-known colleague and friend who said that, you should read his newsletter. So I went to Substack, subscribed, and every week I look forward to your newsletters because that's my source of all the M&As that's going on in EdTech, all the trends. So really big fan of your newsletter. And I'm sure I'm not the only one.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a lot of fun to write. I think that's kind of the origin story. There was a small group of us that used to hang out on Clubhouse on Friday afternoons when the world was still shut down and you couldn't really do anything on Friday afternoons. And there was a certain point where I just had so much energy coming out of the conversation that I wrote a bunch of stuff and emailed it to like 20 or 30 people. And it's kind of grown from there, but I think it's still fundamentally based on what do I find interesting in a given week, and written with the hope that folks like you will read it and say, oh yeah, that is interesting. But not trying to take itself too seriously, just trying to make sense of the world. So I'm glad that you seem to be getting a similar takeaway.
No, absolutely. I like your take on some of these topics, and we'll dive into that. But before we go into the topic today, Matt, why don't you introduce yourself? So, I know that you've worked in that tech space, but how did you get into ed tech? What keeps you here in ed tech? If you can just give a brief on that.
Yeah, as a venture capitalist, we often think about the founder story, and there are like apocryphal founder stories, and then there's the real founder story. And I on some level, I would like the apocryphal founder story to be like, I had two parents who were teachers, which is definitely true. My mom was a literacy specialist through my whole life and is now assistant superintendent. My dad has taught skiing for over 40 years. But I think the real answer is honestly, I was frankly not very good entrepreneur in college. I ran a house painting business, and I kind of stumbled onto this business boot camp back when boot camps were still kind of novel. And I applied because I wanted to be better at business. I wanted to be a better house painter. And things kind of spiraled from there, where I took the boot camp, and then I ended up working full time for them and having, just a amazing set of mentors and really kind of amazing experiences. One thing led to another, and I was working at a textbook publishing company and watching their digital transformation. And then entering the VC world. And, all of a sudden I had been working in ed tech for 6 or 7 years and had this great balance of making, a good amount of money, like a reasonable salary, and also feeling like the work I did had a really high impact. And it was kind of at that point that I started saying, well, maybe ed tech is a great place for me, and a place where I can have an impact and a business career at the same time. And so the last kind of 3-4 years of my career have been trying to capitalize on that, really kind of leaning into the VC world, and now with Workshop, the venture studio world, where we are incubating businesses from their very kind of infancy, and hoping to build really big and impactful ed tech and climate companies.
Great. Can you, love to hear more about the workshop. You just give a just brief introduction. Can you tell a little bit more about workshop?
Yeah, so Workshop is a venture studio. We are backed and founded by the husband and wife team, Chad and Eleanor Lawrence, that founded Simply Safe. And the core premise is that Chad and Eleanor had led kind of successful careers at Simply Safe for Chad and in the education world for Eleanor, and wanted to have their next chapter be working together again with a small team, and also thinking about ways they could make a high impact in the world, with education and climate being two of the most pressing problems we're facing. Obviously, there are lots of problems, but those are two that we particularly like. And really, the goal is to both come up with ideas that we think are compelling in these two areas, and also partner with early stage entrepreneurs. And our value prop, we are a business with a value prop, just like early stage entrepreneurs and businesses worldwide, is to dramatically increase the pace at which early stage companies move, and the probability of success that they have. So there's the widely cited stat that 9 out of 10 startups fail. We would like to believe that we can help improve the probability of success through our efforts in working with these companies.
That's a great mission to have. I mean, that's a great point, because that just, that's the moonshot, can dramatically improve not just stakes for people who are in business, but everybody who wants to get into business, entrepreneurship, right? So, great job there. Love to dive into in today's topic, and we want to talk about workforce learning. There's a lot of conversation. There's a lot happening in this space, right? But before we dive fully into that, what do you think about workforce learning? Because there are multiple ways to look at it. But what do you think? How do we define workforce learning, if we have to define it? And what are those key components that are part of workforce learning?
Yeah, this is a great question, because I think there's also this kind of interesting thing happening in the ecosystem where, ed tech used to be kind of K-12 education technology, and it was all about innovation in the classroom in K through 12, and it kind of grew and morphed, and then it encompassed higher ed. And I think most of the major funders in the ecosystem now include workforce learning in that kind of bucket. And I think the reason for that is twofold. One is opportunity, and there's tons of opportunity and kind of crossover between learning technologies that work in K-12 classrooms and learning technologies that work in the workforce. I think Kahoot is a really fun example of this, where while the preponderance of their users are in K-12, the majority of their revenue actually comes from adults and
Wow.
corporations
Yep.
that pay them. So I think there's kind of interesting crossover there. And I also think it's a realization that the educational journey, as we kind of construct it in our minds, is shifting. It's no longer, frankly, good enough to just go to school through high school or just go to school through college. It's now learning is truly lifelong, because you have to be constantly acquiring new skills. And there's a lot of implications of that, including what do we do for the folks for whom they didn't have the opportunity to kind of continue their learning even beyond college, junior high. We have to work on making further education accessible to them, but I think that the trend is really that you can never stop acquiring skills, and the funders in the ecosystem are realizing that and funding this kind of workforce learning as a result.
Yeah, no, that is, the increase in scope is so interesting, right? I was reading this article the other day, I think by Reach Capital, on every company is going to be an edtech company. That article resonated with me, because if you think about it, today in any company, learning and development is a core function. So if you think about it, every company will become an edtech company in the future. So I think that looking at it from that lens, even LinkedIn is an edtech company that way, right? Lot of companies then come in the purview of education technology, because we are learning all the time. So yeah, that's a very good point.
Yeah, totally. And I think where we haven't settled is like what percent of your annual budget should be devoted to learning, right? And that's we on some level we have a sense of like how much should we spend on finance and how much should we spend on sales and go to market and product. And obviously there's a great degree of variance across companies, but in general, we know how to have the conversation. And I think we don't know how to have that conversation with workforce learning. And I think the rationale for spending on workforce learning really varies with two kind of I don't know if they're opposing forces at play, but there's some nuance in it. Of one is we invest in workforce learning to retain employees because if they're learning on the side, they will stick around longer. And the other is to upskill them into new positions, which may or may not even be at the same company. And so I think this kind of balance between retention and upskilling is kind of under discussed, partially because it's hard to articulate. But the reason you might buy an ed tech product for your workforce could be dramatically different. And I think we're seeing that in terms of what products get adopted versus what kind of stall out, in the kind of demo piloting part of the purchasing process.
Yeah, and that's always a critical component in edtech. I'm sure there's in other industries as well. Product adoption is so crucial, and moving beyond that pilot phase is so important. Which actually brings me to my next point in terms of, given your experience and your exposure to all of this news and companies, what are the key trends that you're seeing in workforce learning? Like, how did it start? How is it evolving right now? What are some of those key areas that you see, if you want to highlight some of those?
Yeah, I mean, I think the most well-known players in the space are largely about helping companies better understand their spending in the space. And I'm going to provide some context to that. If you take a couple of the bigger players like Guild and Degreed, they're providing learning to employees, but perhaps even more importantly, and why they get adopted is they're helping employers understand what's going on with their workforce. So Guild is providing a window into how many of my employees are pursuing a higher ed degree or even a secondary degree, because Guild also does help facilitate that. And it's that kind of context on their workforce that I think is really what gets companies to adopt, rather than the noble and altruistic, but ultimately kind of hard to determine ROI of just getting an employee a degree. And I think Degreed has a similar premise of like, yeah, we're upskilling employees, but we're also helping provide context on the competencies that the workforce has, and spitting those back to the human development, the human resources and professional development functions at the company. I think that's what makes them sticky. Not necessarily like the altruistic stuff is important, but I don't know that that's actually what makes it stick at employers.
Right. And I remember both these companies, I think back in 2016, when I was planning to go to ASU GSV, these companies were there, but I think they've grown exponentially in the last 3-4 years with the kind of focus on this area. So it's very interesting to see the growth story of both of these, the ones that you mentioned, Guild and Degree. There are many other companies in the space, but just these two are, yes, as you said, kind of one of the best known companies.
For sure, and I think they did a lot of the I don't know what to call it. They paved the road, or to use a cliche metaphor, to enable lots of other startups to kind of follow suit. I think like it would have been really challenging to have this conversation with an employer in even 2016. There were folks who were doing it, largely universities themselves on a less programmatic scale, a more local scale.
Mm-hmm.
But I think a lot of the startups we see today in the workforce development space are really building on top of these kind of early unicorns.
Right. And what I think the other thing, the other interesting aspect is also universities themselves becoming morphing more and more into kind of like universities spinning out tech departments within their ecosystem, right? That's an interesting trend as well. If you look at ASU, WGU, you look at all of these universities, you can see that becoming more and more agile and more uh, kind of in that space of workforce learning, trying to tap that market. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a result of competition, right?
Right.
Where they are, and this goes for both nonprofit and for-profit universities, they are always trying to grow and figure out what's the market they can chase next and what's the lowest kind of CAC, customer acquisition cost, that they can find. And seeing these startups develop a more programmatic approach. Like, one of Guild's biggest partners is Southern New Hampshire University. And I think SNHU probably saw like, hey, these students are coming in at a much lower CAC. Like, we should really lean into this, both with Guild and on our own. So I think it's a welcome development. I think it's been painful for some universities that relied on kind of local relationships that may have been usurped by these kind of national players. But I think really that's kind of how progress works. And unfortunately, they're going to have to figure out a way to compete. Goldie Bloomstick, I think, wrote about this just yesterday in her newsletter about the various functions that Western Governors University is considering spinning out that actually will help hopefully enable other universities, more smaller regional universities, to compete with the national players. I thought that was kind of cool.
Yeah. No, that's definitely helpful. What I, what we also see is the rise of the skills stack, right? You spoke about skills, some like reskilling, upskilling. The skill stack is becoming so important in terms of employees in one function upskilling themselves, or employees wanting to move to a different function and reskilling themselves. You see the rise of boot camps. You mentioned that you were in one of the boot camps in the earlier days. How do you see that trend, like boot camps helping with reskilling and helping employees upskill and basically improve the tech stack, the skill stack?
Yeah, and this is an area that, again, I hope we can bring more conversation to, because I think there's this notion that like if you provide it, employees will take it. And I think there's this. It's really kind of sexy to adopt micro-credentials and be like, oh yeah, we can, you can learn, in 4 or 5 minute increments. And we've seen a bunch of investment in that space, and I am probably a lot significantly more pessimistic on that than most in the space. And part of that is through experience. Like, I actually did learn most of my Excel technical competency through Stack Overflow, which fundamentally is a micro learning thing where it's like you put in a question and hopefully somebody on the internet has asked that question before and there's an answer to it on Stack Overflow. But like, it wasn't one or even a dozen Stack Overflow sessions that taught me how to use Excel. It was a series of projects at my employer that demanded that I figure it out. So
Right.
like, yes, the micro learning like worked, but only in the context of a very serious project that had time bound. That was time bound. So I think that connection is often missing in the discussion of skill building. Um, And I think that's one of the reasons that boot camps have done reasonably well is they are time bound and intensive, focused on skill acquisition. And it's probably not sufficient for your whole career to do one boot camp, but I think they can get you to the next level. The same way that my, call it 6 months of Excel based projects got me to the next level of learning Excel. So I think that part of the conversation is often missing. Is it's necessary but not sufficient to provide the micro learning, and it really requires projects and or longer term assessments, what have you, to actually get the skills.
And that's, when you spoke about this Excel skills, it also I was also able to relate to some example from my life. Right, I did not when I first entered in sales. I'm right now in sales and marketing. When I first entered sales, I would go do something, figure out it did not give me results. I would go back, read some blogs on HubSpot, and try out, and then see whether that worked or no. So I can kind of relate in the sense that while the HubSpot blogs and those modules helped, they wouldn't have helped if I wouldn't have had the opportunity to try those out. And that trying out or that project based is so important for us to really sharpen those skills.
Yeah, and it's so hard to design for that. I think is the rub here
Right.
is like, you and I could probably go make a video on like how to do a index match in Excel, and it probably wouldn't take that long. We could probably do it in 30 minutes and have a reasonably good video. But teaching a student when the appropriate time to use an index match is requires so much more nuance. And I think that is a hurdle we haven't quite leaped over yet.
No, absolutely. And not just that. I mean, see, let's say even you create assessments or even create projects for that course, but to make that learning stick is another challenge.
Right.
So yes, 2 months, 3 months, the students will understand, VLOOKUP or index match or any of those functions. But a year down the line, if they've not used it, how do you make that learning stick? That's why it's so important to be, yeah, it just gives me a lot of thoughts. Sorry. But anybody creating courses out there should be thinking on those lines. Like, how do you make that learning stick? That's another important aspect.
Right. Right. Exactly.
Yeah, and when we talk about edtech, right, the conversation is not complete without technology. So, what do you see the role of technology in all of this? In improving workforce learning, where do you see technology can play a role to improve it or to make it better, or just improve the scale?
Yeah. So I think this is trying to balance human versus technology in workforce learning is something we're pretty far from achieving. I just talked about that big challenge in program design of like you can you can put a video in front of a student, and you can add badging and you can add crypto credits for kind of watching the video, but you may still need a human in the loop to actually get the student to understand it and be able to apply it for more than the 5 minutes after they've watched it. So
Right.
the technology question is an important one, and trying to figure out what is left to kind of grease the skids of getting folks to learn better on the job. But that balance, I think, is what we're really struggling with. I think there's been a ton of really great technology building over the past few years. I think Guild really opened up the space for tuition assistance benefits. It used to be like you had to mail a letter to your HR person saying, I want to go back to college, and they might mail you back and say, hey, apply, get in, and if you get, B's or better, we'll send you a check at the end of the semester. And like that was just a horrible way to do tuition assistance. And thank goodness that Guild and others in the space are now saying, well, no, let's like think about this and make it actually reasonable for an employee to accomplish. And similarly, like Degreed, again, there's millions of players in the space, but I'm just going to use these two for consistency. Gave us access to this huge library of vetted content, so that I could now ask a question to an employer approved resource and hopefully get an answer. So I think both of those are great. in terms of what else I would like to see, I think there are probably 4 or 5 companies in the wait, I'm trying to decide what to call it. I guess it's kind of career navigation, but for both employers and employees that says like, hey, based on this data, we think this employee is a good candidate for that job. And from the employer side, it helps to do better workforce planning and, from succession planning to, department planning. I think it's really helpful. On the employee side, I think there's still a gap where, any tool that your employer is helping plan your career, there's kind of incentive for the employer. Again, I don't mean this in a mean way, but it's just true. There's an incentive for the employer to get the best economic return for the employer, whereas the
Right.
employee doesn't necessarily share that incentive. So I think there's still a lot of work that needs to be done towards creating a platform where the employee is getting the best advice possible, not necessarily from their employer.
Right. No, that's a very, very valid one. I mean, in the sense, I think I do a lot of hiring. You've done hiring. It sometimes can become such a blind game, right? In terms of who's the right candidate, or even when you have role changes requested. So I get what you're saying. I mean, I think that definitely would be a lot of value. In all of these things that you're seeing or you would like to see, what do you see will be the key challenges ahead of us, right? Let's say if we have to implement this at scale, or if we have to implement this, what are some of those challenges that you foresee, and what are the things that I think should be done to work around those?
Yeah. So I think, unfortunately for investors, the answer is just that the solutions will rarely be as simple as we would like them to be, or perhaps in the past they have been. So just to jump on, you just talked about hiring. Like, I think there's this holy grail of, take a resume and take a million resumes and spit out the best candidate for this that is totally unbiased and will help your business achieve, 4,000% returns. There are companies that are working on that. And I don't like, I know that all of the founders doing that have really positive intent in terms of what they're trying to build. But I just think the answer probably is never going to be that simple. It gets back to my human in the loop argument of like, that might be a way to do initial vetting, but I'm unconvinced that we currently have the technology to be able to do that with no human involvement. And what that means for VCs like me is the pathway is going to be longer and more expensive to scale, because you need to pay for those humans to do that vetting, and you need to pay for the work to kind of independently validate that your algorithms don't have bias in them. So that was a long-winded answer to your question of, I think anytime somebody sells you a simple solution, you should
Mhm.
either be skeptical or they're doing a ton more work under the hood that you probably should spend some time getting to know and understand better.
Yeah. So what you're saying basically is just that there's no like, at least there's no simple solution. There's some complexity in the problem itself, right?
Yeah, and anytime somebody tells you it's simple, be
Yeah.
skeptical is kind of my point.
Yeah. I'll tell you one conversation, just slightly tangential to this point, but very relevant to our current topic. I was talking to one of my past contacts, and he runs a company with 1,000 employees right now. And I happened to ask him, okay, what is your biggest challenge at this point in time? His answer was, I was expecting something to do with go to market, product, customers. You know what his answer was? His answer was, how do I make my people serious about their careers? Like, I have been taking all of this, like I've taken all these courses from LinkedIn, Udemy. You give me, and I'll tell you, I've taken this course. I've taken these subscriptions for my company, but I still don't see people motivated enough, or vast majority of them motivated enough to complete some of these. And like that makes me wonder, that is my process incorrect? But I was just, that thing stuck in my head, that here is an employer or somebody who's genuinely wanting to see what needs to be done, but he couldn't find a solution to his problem. And it just made me wonder, what could be that solution? And maybe there is a solution, maybe not. Maybe that requires a fundamental rethink of the entire L&D process itself, right?
Yeah, I
So,
mean, some of that gets back to my point about incentives of like very rarely are employee incentives and employer incentives directly
mhm.
aligned. The employer usually has counter incentives, which again, I don't mean in a bad way, and I don't mean that in the sense that like employers are bad. It's just fundamentally different. So I think, frankly, I would like to see a bifurcation where employee resources are different than employer resources. Unfortunately, the payment models for making that happen don't really jive because it basically forces a B2C solution for the employee and a B2B for the employer. And like the employer can write it off as a business expense and the employee cannot. So there's a tension there, but yeah, I think maybe a little bit more emotionally towards your friend's predicament. Spending 2 years sitting in our houses, staring at the walls and staring at our computer screens is causing a lot of people to reevaluate what they care about.
Yep.
I at least for myself, I definitely like had a routine where I didn't necessarily think as critically about, what am I doing on a like macro space. It was like, oh, this is how I go about my day, and I have these rough career progression goals. But COVID changed that, right? And it really caused, I think, a lot of folks, at least from the news articles I'm reading, to say like, what is work life balance? What is my career? How do I want to spend my time? And I don't think we yet have the solutions from the startup world that will help you answer that.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right, right? I mean, it made everybody rethink not just career and work, but also their life. Like,
Yeah.
what is the life goal? And how does career play a role in that? There's a lot of rise of solopreneurs. People who wanted to do something on their own, didn't want to start a company, but didn't want to continue with the company. So, I think all of this, you're right about COVID giving that kind of that the 2 years at home, giving that kind of, I would say, the push to think in those directions. So the future workforce or learning and development will have to be drastically different in terms of how you go about it. So
Yeah,
no,
I
this
mean,
this is
L&D professionals just have to be cognizant of it, and I think they are. Again, like I think
right.
the vast majority of people in those roles are good people who care about the answer to this. It's just it's a different world.
Yeah. And we spoke about challenges, but what are the things that you're very excited about, right? I wanted to bring some positivity here. I mean, it's a positive conversation, but I wanted to bring some enthusiasm here in terms of what are you most excited about from emerging from what we're seeing right now, and what do you want to see more of?
Good question. So I think on the very highest of levels, there's just a ton more spend available in the space. Like there are a lot of dollars flowing in, both from the government infrastructure bills and from companies that realized that investing in their people was a great way to keep their people around. So I think like the numbers in terms of spend in the space is a tailwind for companies trying to produce in it. I also think that the infrastructure to help with integrations is much better now than it ever has been. There's this whole trend towards no code, which is kind of adjacent to the workforce learning future of workspace. Like it enables a lot of the tools that are getting built in the space while not necessarily being kind of learning itself. So I think it's probably easier now to build and pilot a tool than it ever has been. And I think in terms of things that I hope and believe will happen over the course of the next couple of years is we'll get better and better at measuring the impact of these tools, both from an efficacy perspective and making sure that the courses that we're taking are actually worth taking, and meaningful in terms of what they teach learners, and also measuring the ROI to employers and even educational institutions, universities and K-12 schools. I think we're just going to get better and better at saying this tool, which costs my organization, $50, provides $150 in return, either in learner outcomes or business ROI or what have you. I think we're going to get very, very good at measuring that over the next couple of years. Just because, we're going to get very good at measuring that over the next couple of years.
Yeah, and I think that would be exciting and interesting, right? Like, how does that play up? So, no, this has been great, Matt. Is there anything that you would have wanted me to ask, but I have not asked in this? Is there anything that I've missed covering?
Not really. I think the only other thing that I would plug is we've got lots of kind of emerging thinkers in the space that are writing and podcasting and just generally talking about what they hope for the future of education, whether it's K-12, higher ed, or workforce. I think that's, again, one of the positive things of the pandemic is it inspired a lot of people to get out there. I think I'm stoked that you are doing this podcast. There's 5 or 6 people writing in the space that, I think are doing great work. So I think that's just another positive thing that I'm excited for. And I hope more people jump in, is kind of my point.
Great. And Matt, I would love for the audience to, I've derived a lot of value out of your newsletter, and I would love for audience to get hold of that. So do you want to, where can they find you? Where can they subscribe to your newsletter?
Yeah, I did not mean my previous comment to
No. I know that
to be plugged for mine.
No, but this is me coming. This is coming directly from me. This is not you've not told me anything, but I would love for my audience, because I think they'll get a ton of benefit the way I've derived value from your content.
Well, maybe to hedge a little bit, I will plug several, and then conclude with my own. So I think folks that I read fairly religiously are Isabel Howe, who writes the Small Talks Early Childhood newsletter, Paul Fain, who writes the Workshift Workforce Learning and Higher Ed newsletter, Alberto Arenza, who writes the Transcend newsletter, Alex Sarlin, who writes EdTech Insiders, obviously your podcast, and then my own, which is it's called EdTech Thoughts. The URL I have is matthewtower.substack.com. It feels a little weird plugging my own name, so I might have to change the URL at some point. But that's currently the URL, and you can find me on LinkedIn at Matthew Tower and on Twitter MDTower14.
Yeah, and I'll tell you what. Just on the thought of plugging your own name, well, we have the biggest edtech valued company with the person's own name.
So. Fair, yeah. I mean, I don't know what that says about the sector or not, but I guess I'm not the biggest person at the eponymous name. So small solace.
No, I did, but no. Thank you so much, Matt. This has been an absolute pleasure. I think we covered some really good points, and I'm so glad you took the time to talk to me. And I'll put all the links, just for the audience, I'll put all the links in the show notes. The links that Matt just spoke about, I'll put it in the show notes. So feel free to read and subscribe to those newsletters. Thank you so much, Matt. Pleasure having you.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the invite.
Thanks. Bye.